morning. The scripture reading is Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted. And he saith unto them, Be not affrighted, ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen, he is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you unto Galilee. There shall you see him, and he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid.
Good morning. Certainly a blessing and a privilege to be together, to come and to worship God, to extol His name, to be reminded of His great promises for us, His great love toward us, His great reward that is before us. If you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you are welcome and wanted here at the Brighton Church of Christ. If you're looking for a church family to identify with, we are but humble servants who each and every day try to set our hearts and our feet toward that heavenly realm. We want to help one another get there and as many other people as possible. And if that is something that is interesting to you, we invite you to investigate further into the Brighton Church of Christ. I will mention tonight, we will continue our one-word study. We're on the word sin this week. If you have not received or gotten a devotional book, there are a few that are left on the back table back there. There's only 5 devotionals each week, and you could actually take that home this afternoon and read all 5 of them in just a short order and be ready for tonight's word, sin. And of course, that study is based upon the idea that we're doing our family devotionals all on the same page, as it were, and then at the end of the week, we come together and we study a little bit more in depth on the one word of that week. And of course, last week we had Kobe and Caden did our Sunday evening lesson, so we missed last week's word, creation. My plan right now, unless something changes, is we'll do that next Sunday morning just to catch up on that one. But then we'll continue on the schedule that we've had. And then I will mention that today, this morning, we are concluding the book of Mark. I know the Hallelujah chorus is probably sounding in the back of your mind, and that's fine. I find it interesting, about 15, 16 years ago, I was preaching in Leonard, Texas, and I thought, I'm going to preach through the book of Mark. And I made it to about chapter 2, and I think the church got tired, and I got tired, and I quit preaching it. And so about 10 years ago, I was in Corsicana, Texas, and I decided, I'm going to preach through Mark again. And I made it through about chapter 6 and got tired. And today I'm actually going to finish preaching through the book of Mark. There's an emotional reward, at least for me, in this point. And Ron asked me, he said, what if you start to feel sick during the song service? Listen, I will crawl through broken glass to get to finish this last lesson. We're so excited. To me, it is the culmination of what Mark is bringing out. He has kept for us this secret of Jesus as the Son of God. It is finally revealed at the crucifixion, and now we get down to the resurrection and the what is next, as it were. Growing up in a small country town in Oklahoma, we didn't have a lot in our community. And our little school was kind of poor, you might say. But I remember even in elementary school, once a week we'd have library day, and we would go down the hall, and there was this galley-like room. It was long and narrow and had books on each side, and we could go and check out library books. But as with most library books with children, they were not always in good shape. They were old, the covers were tattered or taped on, or some of them even missing. The pages were smeared with mud and grime, and, well, to be honest, some of them were missing. I remember checking out Dr. Seuss's ABC book when I was about first or second grade, and it wasn't until junior high that I realized there were letters past the letter V. There's something disheartening about investing in a book or a novel and getting to the end and realizing there are pages missing. Or one of those 1,000-piece puzzles, and you've spent days and weeks putting it together only to find out that your box only had 992 pieces. We're a bit crestfallen. Disappointed is almost an understatement. You see, we like things to be complete. We like completion and resolution, the reward of finishing something. We want that happily ever after, don't we? And when we go to movies, sometimes they end in a way that you're a little disappointed. You want a little more. Or maybe that TV series that you've invested, 3 or 4 or 5 seasons in, and now on the last season they're going to bring it all to a conclusion. And yet it's not brought to a conclusion. We want everything wrapped up with neat little bows, but life itself doesn't always tie up in a neat bow. Sometimes things are left unfinished until somebody else comes along and completes it. Solomon even made mention of that in the book of Ecclesiastes, that we may build and we may store up only to die before we get to the finish, and someone else comes in and finishes building upon the work that we have left behind. In completion, that's kind of the way we look at the book of Mark sometimes. This may have been actually Mark's intent when he finished this great biography of Jesus the Christ. So let us go to Mark and let him take us back to the tomb early on the Sunday morning when the 3 women are walking in Mark chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mark says that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. We see in these first few verses 3, I would say, very special women. Mark puts a high emphasis on women throughout his gospel, which is very strange to hear the modern people talk about the gospel and talk about the Bible and how it belittles women or it devalues women. Certainly not in the Bible that I read. And in fact, what we find in the book of Mark is that there is a high price placed on women. They do some of the greatest moments and acts of faith that are written about in any part of the Gospels. I'm reminded in Mark chapter 5 when Jairus has come to Jesus and has sought healing for his daughter. And as Jesus and Jairus and the entourage are going back toward his daughter, Jesus stops in a moment and he says, "Who has touched me?" And his disciples say, "Well, Jesus, look around you. There's hundreds of people in this crowd pressing upon you. What do you mean, who has touched you?" And we find out that there was a woman with an issue of blood. We refer to her as the hemorrhagic woman, and she exemplifies faith that Jairus needed to have. The ruler of the synagogue could learn a lesson from whom? From this woman. Mark, as his usual style, simply refers to what she has done or how she was identified, as opposed to mentioning her by name. There was a woman with an issue of blood. Later, there was a Syrophoenician woman in chapter 7, who, though she was on the outside, not a Jew, she was a Gentile, and yet she has faith. And she becomes the example of faith to all outsiders. Chapter 7 and verse 25 and following. Jesus reserved his highest praise found in the book of Mark for who? For a woman. Mark chapter 12, 42 through 44, this widow who gave her last 2 mites. Jesus is amazed at her faith. The woman in chapter 14 who comes and anoints Jesus. The disciples, the insiders, those who should have known, look at this and they rebuke her. You're wasting this oil. And yet Jesus says what she has done is going to be proclaimed alongside the gospel forever as a memorial to her. Mark puts this high price on women throughout his gospel. They are some of the most evangelistic, some of the most faithful, some of the most endearing characters in the book of Mark. And we find the same thing here in the very opening of the last chapter. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. Mark, breaking his usual style, gives them their names, or gives us their names. We know who they are. Mary Magdalene is simply referring, much like Simon the Cyrene, to the place where he came from. Here it is the same. She is Mary from Magdala. Magdala was a city, a small town, fishing village on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. Even there, the excavations have found the only excavated first century synagogue to date. All the other synagogues that have been excavated and found come from 200 or 300 years after the first century. But the synagogue at Magdala dates back to the very time of Christ. The second one is Mary, the mother of James. It's interesting, Mark also mentions these women in chapter 15 and verse 40, and there he calls her Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. And then in chapter 15 and verse 47, he mentions them again, and he calls her Mary, the mother of Joseph. And then here in chapter 16 and verse 1, he calls her Mary, the mother of James. They're almost certainly the very same woman. This woman had 2 sons, James and Joseph. Mark does not give us information on them, much like he did not Alexander and Rufus, the sons of the Cyrene, Simon. Most likely because either they are well known in the first century church to whom he is writing. And so it might be today something like us writing about someone and we simply say, President Trump or just Trump. Immediately, everyone knows who we're talking about. Or Pelosi. Everyone knows who we're talking about. They would simply say, James and Joseph, the brothers. Oh, well, yeah, we know immediately who we are talking about. But it is possible that this Mary is actually Mary, the mother of Jesus. You'll recall in chapter 6 and verse 3 when the people are looking at Jesus. Is this not the carpenter's son? Son of Mary, whose brothers, and they give a list of 4 brothers of Jesus, 2 of whom are James and Joseph. It's possible that this Mary is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Don't know that for certain, but it could be. The third woman is Salome. We find, according to Matthew chapter 27 and verse 56, that she is the wife of Zebedee, which would make her the mother of the Apostle John and the Apostle James. James and John, the sons of thunder. These are amazing women. But what I like about them is where Mark has placed them. Notice, I mentioned chapter 15 and verse 40, it mentions all 3 of these same women, Mary, and Salome. And it says that they are away from the cross a little ways and they're watching Jesus die. Verse 39 was where the centurion, when the temple has been split, the darkness has happened, Jesus has breathed his last, and the centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. And the women are standing back a bit, as it were, and they're watching. They're seeing what's going to happen. And among those women are Mary, Mary, and Salome. When Jesus' body is taken off the cross and carried to the side of the tomb itself, Mark mentions two women that are standing off and watching where they bury Jesus. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. And this morning, they are walking to the tomb, and they'll witness the resurrection of Jesus. And who is it? Mary Magdalene. Mary, the mother of James and Salome. Do you see the early tradition which Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 15, how he proclaimed unto them the things of first import, that is, the death, the burial, and the resurrection. Now, there were other disciples who watched the death. There were others that saw the burial and others that saw the resurrection and had witnessed it. But notice who James puts as the witnesses to the death, the burial, and the resurrection. It is these very special women. And I love that they are on their way to do a great work for Jesus. That is, they plan to anoint his body, his decaying body, with spices. This was a practice done very early in Jewish tradition. Now, we're very familiar with the idea of Egyptian traditions of burial, which included embalming in order to preserve the body. But the Jews did not practice embalming. That's why it was so unusual when Jacob's body was embalmed in the city or in Egypt, so that he would be preserved until the time they could return him to the land of Palestine. But the Jews generally did not practice that. They simply used spices and oil. And many of the tombs that have been excavated throughout the land of Canaan have had bodies of bones that were still laid out as they were the day that they were buried. And all around the body were perfume bottles. Why? Because they were trying to alleviate the smell of decaying flesh. These women want to do a service, even to the dead Jesus. But what's amazing to me is they are questioning among themselves, how are we going to be able to do this? That's a big rock in front of the tomb door. How are we going to be able to accomplish this good work? But notice, they're asking this question on the way to do it. It's an amazing faith. Not knowing how God would step in, they stepped out. How many times do Christians get paralyzed because we don't know exactly how we're going to overcome our obstacles? We look at the world and we say there are things in our way. Well, we can't do it until we sit down and devise a plan to overcome the barriers, to take them out of the way. And what happens is when we get one barrier theoretically taken care of, another crops up, and another crops up, and another crops up, and the entire time we are sitting there not moving. I think there's a great lesson here that we do what we can do, and we trust in God to do what we can't do. That's what these women were doing. This was faith. Faith taught by these wonderful women to generation after generation and generation. Don't let the unknown stop you from doing what you know to be good. Secondly, though, we see the good news angel, we might call him, beginning in verse 5. When they get there, they see that the stone is already rolled away. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Now, Mark does not actually call this man an angel, but I think we can see several of the things by which Mark describes him, connects him to the idea of heavenly messenger or angel. One of the first ones is the fact that he is in white robes. White is the color that is most often reserved for a connection to heaven. We see it, for example, when Jesus in Mark chapter 9 is transfigured. And it says that his raiment or his garments became so dazzling white, it was whiter than anyone could possibly bleach them on this earth. It was too white. Why? Because this white is connected to heaven. In the book of Revelation, we see it used oftentimes. The martyrs that are beneath the altar crying out, "How long, O God?" They are dressed in robes of white. The innumerable host, in chapter 7, verse 9, after he mentions those who were numbered among the faithful, according to the Old Testament, that 144,000, he says, "And then I looked and I saw an innumerable host." And in the description of this innumerable host, their robes are white. White garments were a connection to heaven. And we see that in this man. The message, I think, which he brings is a connection to heaven. He would say, "He is risen, he is not here." Or, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee, just as he told you." He is giving them the message that would connect him to heaven. And then I think his care for these women, "Do not be alarmed," connects him to heaven. He was a heavenly angel. And then we get to this dramatic end. Since the 2nd century, the ending of Mark has been a challenge to believers and followers. Many people today are very familiar with or aware of the last 12 verses of Mark, verses 9 through 20. It contains a dissertation of unbelief. When Jesus meets Mary Magdalene, she runs and tells the disciples, but they, what? Do not believe her, verse 11. Then 2 disciples on the road meet Jesus, and they go back to town to tell the disciples, but they don't believe. Verse 13. Then Jesus appears to the disciples in verse 14 and upbraids them or rebukes them for their unbelief. You see, these last 12 verses are focused on unbelief. And so what do you have to do? The command, you've got to go out and tell the gospel, and he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he that what? Does not believe. It's still a theme of overcoming unbelief. But look at your Bible closely. Many Bibles have a footnote here at about verse 9. A bracket, a mark. A statement that says something like the ESV's, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20. The New King James has an asterisk. And it says the NU does not include these last 12 verses. Some translations put brackets around the last 12 verses, separates it a little bit from the text. Why? Why is this even a question? This often is referred to simply as the longer ending or the long ending of Mark, the last 12 verses. At best, it is questionable. The earliest manuscripts of Mark don't include it. They stop at verse 8. The oldest translations of the New Testament into the Syriacs, the Latin, the Sahitics, stop at verse 8. The church fathers from this time period, the 2nd and 3rd century, don't quote from it. They make no mention of anything past verse 8. Somewhere around the 4th century, Jerome, who was translating what we call today the Latin Vulgate, Eusebius, who was considered one of the first early church historians, says about these verses, they actually make mention say that most manuscripts that they are aware of, and Jerome is aware of very many, said that most manuscripts end at verse 8. Eusebius says the most accurate manuscripts end at verse 8. So why are these 12 verses there? Well, look at verse 8. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, I'm not going to make this a test of fellowship with anyone. I personally believe Mark intended to leave his gospel stopped at verse 8. If you believe that the last 12 verses, there's some evidence that suggests that it might be authentic, but I think most of the evidence points the other way. Again, not a test of fellowship with anyone, but here's what I think. I think Mark stops at verse 8 on purpose. Imagine reading Mark and you get to this end that they left, for they were afraid. Those are the last two words in the Greek of Mark's gospel. For they were afraid. And stop. I know what I would do. I'd turn the scroll over and say, maybe he finished back here. There's nothing there. It's on either side. It just stops. Some say it stops mid-sentence even. I don't think so. I think Mark has a purpose. When we read those words, we are dissatisfied. I mean, look, Jesus, in his passion speeches of chapter 8, 9, and 10, ends each one of them with, on the third day, I will arise. On the third day, I will arise. On the third day, I will arise. And he's telling this to his disciples. And we expect to see him to appear to those same disciples. Even the angel says, just as he said, he's going to meet them in Galilee. We want to see that happy reunion. We want the bow to be tied up. We want it to be neat. But Mark doesn't give us that. We're dissatisfied when the women who are supposed to go out and tell the good news, to proclaim the story, but instead they keep silent, for they were afraid. How will people know the story if they're afraid to tell it? How will it go any further? You see, when we read that, we want more. We want closure. We want completion. We want that bow like what Matthew would give us. But it doesn't happen in Mark, at least not at verse 8. I think that's what was happening in the second century. Some of the scribes were looking at it and asking the same question. Why did this not happen? For 40 years or over 40 years after he completed his gospel, the church seemed to accept the ending at verse 8. But it evidently caused so much consternation that people started trying to finish Mark's gospel. Not only is there this long ending, there's what they call the intermediate ending. There's another long ending that's got some extra verses added to it. And it just says that people kind of all over the place in the second century are saying, we want more. But what if Mark had intended to stop at verse 8 as a cliffhanger to invite us to finish the story? Mark begins his gospel, Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, I'm sorry, no, that's John. Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now here's the question. When Mark says this is the beginning of the gospel, does he just mean those first few stories in chapter 1 or 2? Or does Mark intend that his gospel is just the beginning of it all. Luke did the same thing when he was writing his gospel, and he tells Theophilus these are the things that were started. And then when he gets to the book of Acts, who is the same author, writing Theophilus, and he says, now remember the things that I started telling you. These are the rest of the story, the book of Acts. Luke did it. What if Mark intends the same thing? This is just the beginning. And we get to that end then, and we turn the scroll over and it's not there, and the reader, I think the first century reader as well as the 21st century reader, is forced to say, well, what happened next? Did the disciples ever find out? Did the story ever get told? You see, Mark is leaving that last page blank for me, for my life. You see, when we turn the page, that's us. And every believer since the first century has filled out his page to add to the beginning of the gospel which Mark had started, and now is finished by the grace of God in every single believer. We must tell the story to others in order to turn our page. We tell it to others so they can write their page, and that it is added to the good news, to the greatness of God, the grace of God, and to the story of Christ. The question then comes to you, what does your page look like? Have you written upon that page out of faith? Have you obeyed the gospel to be a part of God's kingdom, of Christ's church? Have you written on your page? And if you haven't, today you can. You can obey His gospel, believing in Jesus as the Son of God. You can repent of the sins, turn away from the old life, trusting in God. You may say, I don't know how it works. I don't need to know how it works. I just need to trust God that it does work. And I have an opportunity to write my page. And you have an opportunity to add your page this morning. Why won't you come and answer His invitation while we stand and while we sing?